Thank you all so much. That was some great related, but very unique talks on big data and all of the promise and potential. And I think, Fard, you kind of touched on too some of the ethical issues that also exist. So speaking of ethical issues, how many of you have heard the story of what happened at Target and the sending out coupons to a family? So when you shop at Target, they collect a lot of data about your what you're purchasing, and they also run a lot of analytics. And they've narrowed down so that they can figure out when they think someone in the household is pregnant. So they send out coupons for things like diapers and strollers and other things that all new parents are looking to purchase. And so Target had sent out their new baby packet of coupons to a family, and the dad called and said, why are you sending my family these coupons? Like, my wife isn't pregnant, my teenage daughter isn't pregnant, like, this has to stop. And he called back a couple months later to apologize because his daughter was pregnant. So, if Target is able to figure out things like when your daughter is pregnant before you can, that just, to me, is such a good example of the power of big data, right? So what I want to pose to our panelists is, how can we as youth sexual health technology promoters, researchers, programmers, what can we do in using big data to promote youth sexual health? What would your ideas be about how we could potentially take advantage of all this data to help us answer some of these questions?
Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a wonky answer, but I think it's an answer, which is, I think part of the difference in the sort of story that you gave about Target is such a great way to draw this distinction, is that in the realm of surveillance, which our AZU project and a lot of other data we work with are surveillance data, the sense has always been that we observe in the HIV field what's happening in populations so that we can make sure that resources are matched up with populations. And I think one of the tensions we're having right now that your story illustrates, and it's happening in the sexual health field as well, is whether big data is used actually to make decisions or sort of probabilities about individuals and link that to interventions, or whether it's used at the level of communities to make resources available and strategize around where services are provided. So it's not really an answer to your question, but I think it's helpful to sort out that we're really talking about two different things, and I think the commercial interests, because it's probably more effective in a way, have really gone after this more individualized marketing. And so I just would like to draw that distinction and say in public health, at least in the field that I've worked most with, which is HIV, there's a slightly different orientation around how we use big data. And I think that these two worlds are starting to collide with, for example, use of surveillance data to do partner notification or provide individualized services, or if you know that someone is living with HIV and not virally suppressed, should the health department use that big government data to intervene? So this is just another lens through which to see this question.
Matthew, Ricardo?
Well, again, not qualified to be on the panel, I shouldn't be able to say anything, but it's only 10 years ago that we went to war with Iraq. And you may remember the Defense Secretary at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, had a great statement where I think he won the Gobbledygook Statement of the Year award, because he said there are known knowns, and then there are known unknowns, and then there are unknown unknowns, right? So the small data thing I talked about at the end, right, was the known knowns. We know certain things. If you have certain if you are Alex outside with his STD triage tool, if you have a rash, you should get it tested, right? You shouldn't just. So how do you get people to make that little decision about things that we know about? How do you get things that we understand work? We know how to cure gonorrhea, et cetera. How do we get that easy stuff done. And there is a tremendous amount of problems in the world of healthcare as a whole getting that easy stuff done. It's all that data I was showing you from the FITEL one, the last of my demos, was about that. You know, we know if people are overweight and have high blood pressure and whatever, they should be an intervention program, but even figuring out who they are and then getting into those programs is very hard. And that has many, many parallels across all of healthcare and across all of life, right? There are a lot of things, you know, we all look down at the scale and know we should be doing better. Well, many of us do anyway. So that's one area, and I think there's a place to pick up that. The other thing where big data has the capacity to do something is the target. Example is which really is the unknown. You know, you run enough analysis over the unknown unknowns, and you start discovering stuff. You start moving stuff from the unknown unknowns to the known knowns, and that's where we have the option. And I don't know the field well enough, but those of you doing research on HIV or any other STD or domestic violence, there's a bunch of connections going on here. And if you look at other areas of society, things like crime, we've done a really good job in some areas of stopping things like lowering murder rates and that kind of stuff by looking at data and figuring out what are the confounding factors, some people call this the broken windows type of policing, that change a neighborhood by changing these things, what little changes can you make that create an environment that improves the potential for outcomes. So I think that if we come back to YTH Live in 3 or 4 years' time, and with more of these data streams, we'll find out more of those answers.
I just have a quick answer to that question. I think in terms of sexual health, I think there are two things. The first is, and I know the target example is touted as something that is highly negative, but it can be used in a positive way. Just-in-time health information when people are at the point where they are about to engage in a behavior that is harmful. And personalization of information. That's something we've looked at closely in our data, and people want personalization. So using these data sets and these information streams to really deliver the highly relevant personalized information just in time to the people who need it the most is probably going to have the biggest impact on really reducing infection rates. So rather than kind of having a scattershot approach in terms of not really understanding when people really need this information, we can leverage these data sets to really go into these communities and those dark areas you were mentioning, and understand these people implicitly and deliver that information. So that's my short answer.
I was at lunch today and we were talking about Facebook and what happens after someone says something on Facebook and getting, I guess, help or stuff with regards to AIDS. But you were saying that 18% of the population wasn't like doing the things that they said they were going to do.
Yeah.
I was curious how you got that secondary data, like how you found out, how you contacted them after.
Yeah. So basically what we do in our studies is that we track them, we profile them before they get into the study, we track them, and then we follow up with questions. So at the end of the study, we ask questions on a range of subjects, so it's not just about sexual health, so we're trying to limit the kind of socially acceptable answers that people might give. And I think we saw a little bit of that in terms of the intent stuff and the difference between follow-through. So at the end of the studies, we ask them a whole bunch of questions on a variety of topics we're interested in, and that's how we got to the 18% number and the media impact score. What I didn't report, which we didn't get a chance to compile, was other impacts on sexual behavior in terms of the folks. So there might have been offline conversations or something with a doctor that might have influenced that more, or it just might have been something they saw like on advertising or something like that. So I don't have those comparative numbers now, but that's something we're gonna take a look at. This is also a longitudinal, so we're gonna continue to look at this question so that we can really get a much broader sense of where people are consuming the sexual information and where it's taking place. In terms of what we're gonna do with that information, we really hope to be able to provide people with a clear sense of how to construct content and deliver it in ways that are gonna make a difference.
Can you guys talk a bit about natural language and who's doing some of the best work on that and how it's being used specifically on mental health issues?
You want to take that one?
No. Oh, good God. So natural language is really complicated. There are a couple of people doing, so the Fountain guys, FOUNT.IN, who did the Twitter thing, they've got a neat little tool for doing, I think what they call disambiguation. Unfortunately, natural language in healthcare is being used primarily in claims extraction, because electronic medical records tend to have a lot of text, and there's a lot of confusion around what's in that text, and there's a lot of companies that extract that. So interesting companies who do that and then try to use useful stuff out of it include CliniThink, Enhanced Medical Decisions, Nuance purchased a company called L&H who do that. So there's a lot of people trying to do some natural language extraction out of text recognition. They're not using it primarily. They're trying to get, somewhat trying to get problem lists out of it. And I assume that includes mental health. Now you're stretching my knowledge of the field here. My understanding is that it's really, really hard to do. And that the problem with it, a lot of it, is that the accuracy rates are in the 80s for many of these guys, 80 percentages or so, 80 percentage points. And that there are so many false negatives and false negatives. Who's the statistician around here? Is that a false negative? That's a false negative. Well, false positive? There's both. Anyway, the answer is there's some stuff that's wrong, right? And if you get enough stuff so for example, I used Dragon 7 back in the day, and it couldn't understand me or my accent. So, it was a complete waste of time. I might as well have gone back to typing, even though I can only type very slowly. There are some problems with both speech recognition but also natural language recognition. And the other interesting thing about this is that mental health, which is a sidebar but very relevant, I think, for everything we're doing here, mental health is the area that is moving fastest onto online care and online treatment. We've had 2 or 3 panels over the years of Health 2.0 of new companies who are doing basically cognitive behavioral therapy, both using video but also live therapy. And that's, and people just using Skype for mental health. There's a huge amount of that going online. That's going online faster than any other form of healthcare treatment, and obviously very relevant for the group here.
So I have a 2-part question. First is, what do you see of the role of big data in low prevalence in low density population states like Alaska? And also, what are some tips to how you use that big data ethically in our states?
So I'll just say this is an issue that we've wrestled a lot with at AIDSView, and we've worked with all the state health departments from the New Yorks and the Floridas to Alaska and to other places where data are more sparse. And what I would say is that we really strove for a national standard about that balance between, and just to make sure we're all, the framework in which I think about this is, if we're reporting that there are 3 people living with HIV in a county, for example, or 3 people who are Hispanic, of Hispanic ethnicity living in a county, and there are only 20 such people in the county, then we're talking about indirect identification, essentially. And so historically, when you look at our maps, basically a big part of the middle of the country, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, although it wasn't on that view, just sort of gets zeroed out, essentially, and not reported on. And so I think that this is an area, particularly the kind of data that we deal with in the surveillance piece, is collected using government authority. It's mandated, it's not optional, you can't opt in or out. And so there's a high level of responsibility, and it has to be a dialogue within communities about where the good that's come out of visualizing data outweighs whatever the risks are. And so I think that one of the issues you're raising is that if you have programs that take a national approach and set a national standard, they really become unuseful for areas with lower prevalence. And so I think one interesting step would be through something like the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists to get those lower population density states together and talk about whether there's another framework that is the right balance there. But I think in our case, the lower population density states get caught up in trying to develop a national standard that is comparable.
So just very quickly, I'm a believer that states should be abolished. And most people who run those states believe that science should be abolished. So between those two, you'll get rid of that problem. But the one thing so that there's the data problem. But the one thing that's beautiful about the internet and the modern world that we're in now is that states are somewhat irrelevant when you're looking to find low-density diseases. So if you have low-density diseases of various kinds, even if they're low-density in a region, you can find other people who have ideas about how to treat it and how to deal with it, but also other people who have that disease and find them online very easily. And there's no, it was said best by a guy called Steve Brown at the first Health 2.0 conference, with the internet and Health 2.0, there is no need to be alone. And I think that's very powerful for people who are undergoing, who have those conditions and those treatments.
Patrick, I wanted to ask you, as people get these really sophisticated mapping capabilities on AIDSview, is that changing the action that they're taking on the data versus what they were doing when it was just seeing books like the one at your bedside?
I think that there are examples, and we've heard just spontaneously of examples, and it relates actually to this last question about Alaska, of how people have used the data in ways that we didn't anticipate. So we actually heard from a guy in Alabama who was developing a telemedicine sort of network, and he used the AIDSview maps to see where there were high concentrations of people living with HIV where there were not overlying medical clinics, and those were the spots they picked to develop these sort of centers where people could come in and do telemedicine connections to providers in the bigger, this was in Alabama, in the bigger, in the Birmingham area. So I think, one sort of retrospective example was another sort of block-by-block testing HIV prevention program in New York, where they actually developed their own data to decide where to target. And they said right as they launched, we put up the first New York City maps. And they said they spent 2 years trying to triangulate in and pick the smartest place, and they came up with the same places that we posted right after they started. So they estimated they could have started earlier. So I think that people are using the data differently, and again, just in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And this idea of, for example, telemedicine and identifying gaps in lower prevalence areas is also another kind of opportunity.
In thinking about the data that's out there, it can give us also creative ways of assessing impact. I think we struggle in research on youth sexual health. Like, right, we have websites and we are using Facebook, but how do we actually know if we're having an impact with our users? Are we getting people to go and test? Are we reducing STD rates? And I think maybe there are big data sets out there that will let you look at those outcomes in your area. So that's, it's going to vary, obviously, but I think it's a creative way of looking at data that's already being collected in your community to really be able to look at impact. So you driving up testing rates in your particular community without actually having to go to the clinic yourself and collect that data. So it might be a much more economical way of looking at the impact.
I love the idea of big data, even with all the ethical caveats. But what about, the big cliche of data is only as good as the questions we ask? So what about populations like trans folks, transgender folks, or people with disabilities? We know very little, for example, around HIV prevalence for any of those people. How can we use big data to show that there are huge gaps in terms of the questions we ask and the data we collect on a state and federal levels?
Can I just say thank you for asking that question, and that was one of the points I wanted to raise, is I think we talk about the promise and potential of big data, but it's really important to think about the limitations and what data is actually being collected, right? So just as you said, it's only as good as the data you're collecting, and we need to recognize the limitations of our data sets. So.
But I think this is also part of a quality improvement cycle that, I always encourage the folks where I'm part of research teams to look at the data early on in the process and figure out your problems when you're 10% of the way in rather than when you're 100% of the way in. And in the case of some of these systems that are collecting clinical data, collecting surveillance data, variables that never get looked at never get called for improvement. And I think the case of collection of some of these items at CDC, even when I was there a number of years ago, that because communities came forward and said the data that you're asking us to collect really doesn't let us get at all the highly impacted communities, that led to discussion and refinement of what the data elements are. So it needs to be a process of looking at data and figuring out where the gaps are and what's being collected poorly and integrating them. And I do think that the other opportunity of big data is in this case of communities that may have smaller numbers in any one place, but across health networks, across the Veterans Administration, for example, there are actually substantial numbers of transgender persons, for example, and Emory, one of my colleagues at Emory has recently gotten a grant from NIH to actually look across some of these big clinical data sets at long-term health outcomes for trans people using putting all these data sets together. So I think that there's sort of an upside and downside. In some cases, the data are poorly collected, but in some cases, when they're linked to procedures or codes, it's an opportunity to get a much larger group to look at important health outcomes. And so some of that is moving forward supported by NIH.
I actually wanted to just make a point regarding your question in particular as it relates to the human component of all this. You know, one of the things about machines is that it's, you know, whatever you put in is what you're going to get out. And I think where we're going with regard to the relationship between human beings and machines is that machines have the ability to do a lot of the boring, repetitive, huge analyses that we aren't able to do as humans, or don't do it as well. But humans have the creativity to be able to ask those types of questions. So that's actually a call for why we need, and I don't want to sound PC, but why we need a diversity of perspectives as it relates to conducting this type of research, so that we can actually think about asking the questions, so that the people who have access to those data sets understand that that's something that they should be focused on. And so the creativity part, which is human, needs to be coupled with the automation part, which is what we get with the machines, to be able to fully realize the benefits of big data. And so I just wanted to thank you for asking that question, because it demonstrates that perfectly.
The question was, do the panelists know about collaborations between the public health sector and some of the big companies that we know in this area? Yeah.
So between the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Googles, not enough, right, is the answer. But they're all they're coming into this slowly. So Twitter actually came to the last Health 2.0 conference, and before that had been at some of the hackathons and codathons about healthcare, to explain how to open up their stream. So they're not going to do it themselves, but they're going to encourage people like Fountain or others to take a look, to use their tools, and also take a look at their data stream to find information about it. Google actually built internally a thing called Google Flu Trends, which, going back to the sort of how do you tell, how are you not asking the right questions? Can you abstract out of people's Google searches what's going on with them? Well, you know, you can do it for flu trends, but you can also do it for STD searches or whatever else, you know. So Google did do that. Unfortunately, the guy who ran that at Google, Ronnie Zeiger, has gone off and is doing his own startup, and they've kind of lost a bit of momentum. And then Facebook, I don't think Facebook has done much in this area, but it's very interesting that there have been some people who've done studies of Facebook updates and gone back and looked at Facebook updates and realized that people actually had illnesses and conditions they didn't realize they had. And in fact, there's a very, very sad story about Regina Holiday, who some of you may have heard of, who, talking about e-patients, is one of the leading patient advocates. She's an artist. Her husband died after kidney cancer, and I can't do the story justice. It's an amazing, terrible story about his treatment, and the lack of how, not big data, but small data about him really hurt him. But one of the things she did after he died, she went back and looked at his Facebook posts. He was an avid Facebook user and posted about his status all the time over the months up to his diagnosis. And it was clear that something was going very wrong with him, and she could have figured it, you know, a better use of Facebook could have figured it out. So there's a lot of potential there. And I didn't mention, and I just looked at, talking about Twitter, David's tweet. There are a couple of companies, Medify is one of them, and Tredo is another, that also go in and look to online communities and look at information that's online communities, and abstracting information out of the way people are posted into online communities. So I was a bit negative about the natural language stuff before, but there's a lot of potential there. So I think you'll see some more of that coming in the future.
Great. Well, with that, Matthew, I think you've sort of given us our marching orders to develop more of those collaborations and think about how we can develop them to promote youth sexual health. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Deb.